Hi, my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the founder and CEO of Third Stage Consulting Group. We're an independent digital transformation and ERP consulting firm. We help clients select and implement software solutions of all different types, ranging from Microsoft Dynamics, which is the topic of today's conversation, as well as SAP, Oracle, and other types of enterprise and digital solutions. And today's video is entitled How to Prepare for Your Microsoft Dynamics 365 Transformation. And the reason I wanted to put this video together is we work with a lot of our clients every day that are going through these D365 transformations or about to go through these transformations, and they don't really know where to start. The immediate instinct is to bring on a VAR or a system integrator to come in and just start doing stuff. You start designing the software, you start building it, you test it, and you start deploying it. Sounds simple enough, but the reality is there's a lot of work that needs to be done up front to get ready for a transformation, particularly if you want to make good use of your resources, your budget, and not run into the challenge that so many companies run into, which is that they go over budget, they tend to take longer than expected, and they often fail to deliver the expected business benefits. So the whole idea here is, what is it we can do to make sure that by the time we get the VAR or the system integrator fully involved, we've got that army of consultants on site that are billing by the hour, the meter's running. What can we do to make the best use of their time so that we're not spinning our wheels trying to make rushed decisions around how we're going to run our business when we've got an army of consultants that are charging by the hour? So this whole concept of transformation readiness, implementation readiness, is intended to mitigate that risk and really help stabilize the project, make sure you have control of your project, and ensure that you minimize risk and operational disruption at the time of go live, which is what most of us want to accomplish with our transformations. So that's the intent of the transformation readiness concept. And when we look at digital transformation initiatives, we see that there's a number of things on this slide that describe what the enablers are. So D365 is just one enabler. You've also got your implementation partner, your VAR, your system integrator, whatever you want to call them, your third-party Microsoft Dynamics consulting group, and then you've got yourselves, your own internal resources. And the things that add to the complexity, or the things that need to be focused on during the transformation, moving to the right side of your screen, is the process side of things, the technology, the people, and then the business operations. So you hear a lot of people say process, people, and technology. Same kind of concept here, except we added another layer of the business itself. So these are the four components that we really think about when we think about transformation readiness. What are the things we need to do, not just to get ready for the technology side of things and getting ready for the software, but more importantly, how does it affect and what do we need to do to prepare our business processes, our people, and the overall business? So when we look at the transformation complexity factors, things that are going to drive your implementation duration, your cost, and your risk either up or down, it's based on a number of criteria here. You see the major components here listed on this slide. The ones with stars are the ones that have the biggest impact. So the degree of process change that you're about to go through is going to have a big impact on your duration and cost. The amount of impact to, or the potential resistance from, people will have a big impact on your duration and cost and risk, and as will the technology itself. And there's a number of other components too. You look at the overall, how broad is your scope of the functionality or the functional expansion of your current ERP footprint compared to what you're going to move to. Your geography, if you're in multiple locations or countries, that's going to drive your cost and complexity and risk up. Your level of sophistication internally, your team experience with ERP systems, or ideally D365 or a legacy Microsoft products at the very least, that will help mitigate some of the risk and time and cost. And these are just some of the things that we need to think about as we're defining what is our implementation plan going to look like, and what's a realistic implementation plan. And I'm not talking about the boilerplate 6-month implementation duration proposals that you typically get from VARs or system integrators that they just kind of use as a starting point and that salespeople use as a way just to kind of give you something to start with. We're talking about what's this really going to take. It may not be 6 months. It may be 18 months based on a number of these criteria and other planning that we go through. But the idea is that during this transformation readiness phase, part of the intent of going through this is to identify what is the realistic implementation duration, cost, and resources that are going to be required for the transformation. And there's a number of outputs and things that come out of transformation readiness that allow us to get ready for the actual implementation itself. And we're actually going to dive into this a little bit more. There's a lot of words on the slide, and in the interest of time, I won't read through it. But the whole idea here is there's a number of outputs coming out of each of these different work streams you see on the left side of the screen that should be coming out of your implementation readiness phase, I should say. And those will feed into your overall implementation to help enable a more efficient, a more effective, and a lower risk, lower cost transformation. And what we find is companies that actually take their time to do this right, and we're not talking about a huge amount of time, we're talking a few months on the high end for larger organizations. Smaller and mid-sized organizations may take a few weeks or a handful of months. So the idea here, though, is that the companies that invest time in implementation readiness, and they're ready to roll once the system integrator and the VAR shows up on site, those companies tend to implement a lot faster, a lot less expensively, and they tend to introduce a lot less risk into their organizations when they do this. Again, you can look back to the dynamic of what so many organizations do. The instinct is we picked Microsoft Dynamics. Now let's just start going. Let's bring the VAR in. Let's bring in a bunch of consultants, and we'll just start designing and building stuff. But you get into that and you realize we're not ready for this. I mean, we're not ready, so we're gonna slow things down while we try to make decisions, and it's going to get really expensive and time consuming. Or even worse, perhaps, is we end up rushing ourselves into decisions that lead us back to where we started. So we're just putting in D365 to automate the way we've always done things. So those are some of the things to be thinking about as we think about the value of transformation and implementation readiness. Now, when we look at what is a D365 transformation or implementation readiness plan, these are the 5 major work streams and the major activities that happen which within each of them. And we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. But to summarize, to start, you have your strategic and executive alignment at the top, making sure that what we're doing on this transformation is fully aligned with what the strategy of the organization is, what the expectations of the executives are. And then we have general operational strategic alignment around what this project means to the organization and what the governing principles and project governance parameters are going to be for how we make decisions and how we make sure that it stays aligned over time. We also look at operational readiness. So how ready are our business processes? How well defined have we figured out what we want to be when we grow up? Have we figured out what our operating model is going to be, our overall business model? If we know there's fundamental problems with the way we operate, let's figure that out now and define what that should look like in the future. And then we'll figure out how D365 is going to help us enable that. Now, there's going to be certainly certain areas that D365 will help you determine what your operating model is going to look like. But there's some fundamental aspects of your business that are probably either broken or they're super important to your business. And you want to make sure you fix that or address that stuff first and have a clear roadmap, almost a business blueprint for how you're going to deploy technology. And that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about re-engineering every single nook and cranny of your business before you ever start implementing technology. We're talking about those high value areas or the high risk areas within your business. Then you have your people readiness, the organizational chain component right in the middle. We'll talk about that here in a second. Your technical readiness, how ready are we from a internal infrastructure perspective and an internal IT perspective? It's super dangerous, but yet super common to think, okay, we're moving to D365. We're not going to need that same infrastructure we used to have because now we're operating in a cloud environment, or we're not going to need as much IT staff. So because we're going to be operating in a cloud environment. Maybe true, some of that may be true longer term, but in the short term, at the very least, you need to define how are we going to transition this and how is our IT department going to best enable our deployment? How can we create the maturity we need within our IT department? How can we define our infrastructure plan and defining how we're going to migrate from our current on-prem systems to our cloud solutions? All that stuff needs to be figured out before you start bringing in the armies of consultants. And then finally, you have your project governance and planning at the bottom of the screen there, which is something that runs throughout the entire project. That's where we were defining our project charter, the overall project team, what that's going to look like. We start to mobilize the resources. So again, by the time we fully embrace or integrate with our VAR, we have a clear team in place. The team's been allocated, they've been mobilized, and we can keep up with the VAR basically, because the VAR is going to move as fast as they can. And more often than not, the organizations that are implementing have trouble keeping up with the VAR because the VAR, they're experts in what they do. It's not their business. They're focused on the technology, but you're focused on your business, and we've got to figure out how do we keep the business caught up to the technology piece. So if we look at each of these one by one, the first is that implementation. The first component within the implementation readiness is the strategic and executive alignment. So this is where we look at, first of all, educating executives on what to expect from these type of engagements. What are the rules of engagement? What are the parameters for this type of project? What are some best practices and benchmarks of what other organizations experience with these types of projects? And also looking at the reality, the dark reality of these types of projects. They're difficult, and what's difficult about them? How do we mitigate risk on these projects? And just really educating the executive team so that they can be more aligned with the realities of how this project's going to look. So that's the educational side. The other part, which is equally, if not more important, is really just making sure we have a clear articulation of what their strategy is. When I say their, I mean the executives or the overall corporate strategy. And how does this project translate, or how do we translate those strategic objectives into strategic objectives for this transformation? So really not redefining your strategy necessarily. Most companies we work with have a fairly clear idea of what they want to become, where they're headed, but the idea is how do we articulate that in a way that gives us very clear parameters for how we're going to manage this transformation and make sure this transformation stays aligned with that future state executive and corporate strategy. We also look at operational readiness. So that's that business process component that you saw in the previous slide. This is where we look at those high value areas that deserve some sort of a deeper dive or further attention prior to starting implementation. Just to give you examples of things that would or would not be included here, areas that might be included here would be a retailer that's thinking about going into an omni-channel environment. They're a bricks and mortar retailer. They perhaps haven't caught up to Amazon yet, and they're trying to figure out how do we deal with this whole Amazon effect, and how do we become truly omni-channel, where we've got a clear view of our customer across multiple channels, and we're also servicing and offering our products or services throughout the entire omni-channel, or throughout the multiple channels in the omni-channel, and how do we be consistent in all that? That's a pretty big deal, and technology will enable you to do that, but we've got to figure out what that means to us as an organization first. And so that would be an area where we'd want to dive into that whole omni-channel customer experience. That would be something that would be worth diving into for your retailer or an e-commerce distributor prior to your implementation. And then once we get to the implementation, we'll have a clear high-level framework of a roadmap, and then from within that, we build out the details of how D365 will support that. But if we don't have that first layer up top, we're going to run into a lot of trouble trying to figure out what we want to be when we grow up, and it's going to get real expensive and time-consuming too. So that's one example of what we would include here. What we would not include here would be something like accounts payable. Really optimizing our accounts payable process so we can pay our vendors as quickly as possible. That's usually not on the high priority list for most of our clients. And that's an area we would probably set aside and say, you know what, we're not going to worry too much about that, because whatever D365 does in terms of accounts payable is probably going to be more than enough from what we need. And we're probably going to adapt whatever works best within the system, because that's not a high competitive differentiator for us. Whereas the e-commerce and the omni-channel example for a retailer, bricks and mortar retailer, is absolutely critical. So two examples there of areas that would or would not be included here. So the idea is we pick out the highest value areas, we figure out how we're going to address those business process improvements, map out those processes, and provide a bit of a business blueprint for how we're going to deploy Microsoft D365 in these areas. The other benefit of doing this too, by the way, it's a secondary benefit, but it's very valuable, is that you can start implementing some of these changes and improvements to your processes now, even before you start rolling out the technology. Technology will probably further enable some of those improvements and make you even more efficient, but there's no reason to wait 1, 2, 3 years, or however long it's going to take you to implement D365. There's no reason to wait that long. You can start rolling out some of these changes now, especially the high value ones. And it also, from a change management perspective, makes it easier for your employees if you incrementally change some of this rather than waiting until day one of go live and just springing a bunch of change on them in one big bang. Even if you're doing a phased approach, it's going to feel like a big bang to your employees. So let's figure that out too. That's another component of the operational readiness. And we move on to that third work stream we saw on that earlier slide, which is the people readiness, the organizational change strategy. What is this impact going to mean to our organization? How big of an impact is this to us? Certain departments, certain business units, certain geographies are going to have higher resistance and higher impacts than others. And the idea here is understanding what that breadbox is. Where is that resistance from change going to come from? It's not a matter of is there going to be resistance, because there will absolutely will be. It's a matter of where's it going to come from and what will the root cause of that resistance be, and how can we uncover that and start to address that resistance to change now before we even start talking about how we're going to design and deploy the technology. Another component within that is, we do that organizational readiness assessment first to figure out what the impact is, but then we look at how the organizational change team should be structured, what the organizational change and communication plan and strategy should look like. And that should ultimately feed into your overall implementation plan too. And because this is something that's usually on the critical path, this whole people work stream, it's generally your people that are going to slow things down the most. It's probably not going to be your technology. It's probably not going to be your VAR. It's probably not going to be even data, even though data often is a big problem. Usually people are the bigger problem and the bigger challenge to make sure we really address that well. So we need to make sure that we've got a clear plan and strategy, and we understand that magnitude of change so that we have a realistic duration and cost estimate, as well as a risk mitigation strategy for addressing those risks. Those are some of the things to think about on the people component. And then on the technical readiness, there's two components of this, or two high-level components. One is, how is our infrastructure going to change when we think about data, networks, and internal physical infrastructure? How are we going to move from that to a cloud D365 environment? What's the migration plan? How are we going to move all that data and all the guts of our organization, basically the back end guts of our organization? How are we going to move all that from on-prem to the cloud? That's a pretty big deal that we've got to figure out as part of our transition plan here. There's also the second major component is more the, call it the organizational infrastructure within your IT group, particularly. How can we make sure that our IT department isn't just coming along for the ride, but they're equal peers to the system integrator or the VAR? How can we get them educated and up to speed and full participants in this whole process so that the VAR system integrator isn't just off running the project on their own, but that we can be peers on the organizational IT side of things? So that's the other big component, is how can we create that parity with our system integrator? And also, more importantly, longer term, how do we build that self-sustainability so that our IT department is able to support us in a way that doesn't rely on a bunch of outside consultants going forward? And then finally, the project governance and planning. And really everything we just talked about culminates into this, what is that overall plan? What is the transformation strategy? Again, you probably have a starting point implementation plan or a proposal from your VAR system integrator. But chances are it's probably not realistic, because there's all this work we just described has not been done yet. Until you do all this work, it's very difficult to understand what that transformation strategy, plan, duration, cost, risk really looks like. And so we need to use those as inputs first. And then we finally get into the project charter, the plan, making sure we've got the project team laid out and identified. We start to mobilize the resources. And we also have a risk mitigation plan or management plan at that point. So that's a bit about Microsoft D365 transformation readiness. Again, it's important to take that time, which could range from a handful of weeks to a handful of months, to get ready for your transformation. This is a service offering that we very commonly provide to our clients, and something we work side by side with the system integrator VAR that you're working with to help identify and make sure that we've addressed some of these key things early on. And again, we come at it from a technology agnostic perspective. We are not a VAR of Microsoft D365. We don't specialize only in D365, and that's a good thing, because we come in with a fresh perspective, a technology agnostic point of view that has been scaled up to big SAP projects on down to tier 2 solutions. So that skill set and that outside perspective is very important to help you get ready so that ultimately you control this transformation when it begins. And this transformation readiness piece is a key first step in that. So if you have questions about this video, you'd like to chat more about it, feel free to reach out. Don't have my contact information in here. I have a placeholder, but it's eric@thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also look up our website at thirdstage-consulting.com. I also encourage you to download our definitive guide to successful Microsoft D365 transformation. You can download that by clicking the link down below in the information description here of this video. And it's a great 30-page manual or guide for how to make sure your project succeeds. So I want to thank you very much for your time. Hope you enjoy this video, and look forward to chatting soon. Take care.